Dave here, how are you? Recently I built a waterfall benchtop out of a slab of spotted gum for one of my daughters for her new kitchen in her new home. The brief for the job was to have this waterfall benchtop marry up to a Caesar stone waterfall benchtop on an island bench in the middle of the kitchen. Had a couple of problems. How do I support the weight of something that was over 2 meters long? Stools had to fit underneath. It had to take the weight of people leaning on it, all that kind of stuff. How do I connect it to the Caesar stone? How do I keep a waterproof finish over the whole lot, seeing it's a kitchen area? And how do I keep it connected to the floor? How do I build it? How do I build the joints so they're going to be strong enough to withstand everything? And using natural timber of a slab, how do I keep it straight and stop it from twisting? All of these problems were thrown at me, and I had a bit of a think about it, and this is how I went about it. Here's a picture of the finished item. So I achieved what I set out to get done. The slabs were sourced by my daughter and her husband, and they arrived in my shop a couple of meters long by around half a meter wide. They had the pith of the center of the timber was down the middle, and it was really poor. So the first thing I had to do was to cut that pith out. Now before I cut the pith out, I marked the ends of the slab so that I knew I wanted to bring the slab back together as an original piece of timber. So I marked the ends, I marked the top, I marked the bottom, whatever, and where the joint actually was. And the slabs were pretty good. There was a little bit of a cup in it. Ran it through the thicknesser to take the cup out. Then once I had a dead level surface, I could rip the rest off the side of the pith that was still pretty dodgy. So I think I took about 1.5 inches out of the center of each side of the slab. So we lost 3 inches out of the slab. Now you'll see I'm working with 2 slabs. One slab is for the actual top of the bench, and the other slab is going to be cut in half, and that will be the waterfalls either side, which are basically the legs of the bench. To bring the slabs back together, I needed to cut a glue joint. And I did that with the TS55, and I didn't put it over a joint or anything like that. It was perfect, straight off. Okay, next thing to do is to bring the slabs back together. So I'm marking out here where all the tenons are going to be. I'm going to use slip tenons. Next thing is to separate them and clamp the boards down and use the domino. I'm using the XL domino, and I'm using the 12mm katarina. Anyone who's used one will tell you how great they are. The next thing to do is to glue it all up. So I run around and I glue, and then I pop in the tenons, the dominoes, and then we have to clamp it. I like to set the clamps out on the bench first and then put the pieces of timber on top to actually do the glue up, and then drop them down and pull them together. I don't have a lot of time to muck around. This glue is going to go off in around 15 minutes, and it's not really very workable after that. There's a lot of stuff here to glue. So here we go, we drop it down onto the clamps and pull it up. I use the 4 clamps underneath over that length, and then I drop a clamp intermediately over the top of the other side. So I'm giving equal pressure, so rather than trying to bow the board up, it's getting a reverse push from the ones on the top. And it works quite well that way. Okay, with the glue, as I'm clamping up, the glue is going to ooze out. So the next thing to do is to get an old wide chisel, clean off the excess glue, and then I went over it with a wet rag as well, just to get rid of anything that might have soaked into the timber. I don't want to leave anything that's going to stain at all, even though I am going to run it through the thicknesser, just in case. So it's looking pretty good, and I can hardly even see where the glue joint is now. It's brilliant. So now I have to find out whether or not the board is still flat after it's been glued together. So I lay it upside down on this dead flat bench, and I noticed that there's about a 3mm twist at either end. So it's about 6mm overall. So what I do is I mark where I think the twist is being, and I have to remove part. So then I get the plane out and I plane it so that I get rid of that twist on the high side. Once I've got rid of that twist on the high side, I'll turn the board over and then run it through the thicknesser. That's the easy way to do it. Now to see if I've got rid of that twist totally, I could have flipped the board back over onto the bench, or just as easily I can put winding sticks at either end, and here I've got my levels I'm using as winding sticks, and I can sight along and see if they're in line or not. A little bit more touch up with the hand plane just to clean it off a little bit more because I hadn't quite got there. And now I'm ready to put it through the thicknesser. So I flip the board over, run it through the thicknesser, out it comes the other side, dead flat. Then I can turn it back over the other way and run it through the thicknesser again, and that will give me my parallel all the way through. Works. Now that I've got these dead flat boards, I can cut the miters. So I'm going to use the TS55 on an 800mm track, and I'll lock it down with the clamps underneath. This is a great system. Zap it through. Next thing to work on is the joint. So the joints at either end are going to be done with 6mm dominoes. Now the dominoes I'm setting probably around about 3 inches apart on these joints, and I'm using the Seneca adapter on my Excel domino. Now the Seneca is not something that Festool make, it's an aftermarket product. It allows me to use all of the small cutters on my Excel. I'm happy with them all except for the 4mm. The 4mm, it's such a big machine, and the 4mm is such a small cutter that I do find that there is a little bit of movement and I get a bit of slop. But the 5mm, don't ask me why, it works perfectly. Next thing I want to do is I notice that I've got a few splits in the board still, and I want to get rid of those, but I don't want to just use filler, I want it to actually bond it. So I sand the boards for a while just to get them down to get them down to about 120, and then I use a lot of that sawdust that came out of the sander and mix it with epoxy resin. I'll paste that and I'll actually push it into all of these cracks, and I'll leave it sit there, until it's dry next day. Come back the next day and hit it with a Rotex and take it back with slightly more aggressive paper. There you go, I've got a beautiful result. I sand the whole thing down with 240 grit all the way down. So I go 80, 120, 180, 240 grit. Finished. Then I run it over with the vacuum, and just to suck up any bit of dust that might have got stuck in the pores, or maybe a little crack that I haven't found. Now I had to put a finish on it. I could have oiled it, but oils tend to make things darken up a fair bit. So I thought I'll go with something that's designed for its hard wearing surface, and what better than a flooring finish, and I used a water-based flooring finish. And I put 3 coats on, and in between coats a quick light sand with some 240 paper. When I was working on it, I'd flip it over, I'd sit it up on painter's pyramids, or even for the edges. I had these little yellow pyramids that held it up so I could put a finish on the edge without touching what was below it. And I could see if there was any drips happening so I could catch those quickly. Works well. Then, of course, I have to take it to site. The bench top is 2.1 meters long, but I did manage to fit it in my little car. I just dropped the passenger seat down low, slid it in from the back, and all the other accessories and the tools are in there as well. One of the first things I have to do when I get it to site was I had to fit the ledger. When the cabinets were built, I had a chat to the guy who built the cabinets, and I said, look, please give me about 100mm below your bench top finish height so I can screw a ledger to it to support this waterfall top, so I don't have to actually do any mechanical fixing into the Caesar stone. And that was great. It worked brilliantly. So I put the ledger in at the exact thickness of the bench top that I'd made, and then cut the legs on the bench top so that I had the height from the Caesar stone, which was already in place then, down to the floor. I had allowed another 20mm in the height so I could trim on site. I used the 800 rail with the track saw, docked it off, perfect. Before I glued the unit together, I sat each leg on the floor to make sure that that cut was perfectly 90 degrees and sticking up, and also just in case the guy who put the Caesar stone on, maybe he was out a little bit, so I could just swing it so that it was exactly the same angle off the floor as the cabinet was, and I got there. It looked terrific. So anyway, I glued it all together, clamped it over the top. There was no real need to put any clamps downwards because the weight of the top was pulling it down. And also, as the joint was going together, those dominoes are such a perfect fit that as I was pulling sideways, it was also pulling itself down. Magic. Cleaned off the excess glue, siliconed all the way around the Caesar stone on the edge, pulled the still wet unit. So the glue hadn't dried yet. The glue is still only just fresh in the bench top. Pushed it all up against, pulled it in at the base just to make sure it was perfect. Silicone on the floor as well, so I was gluing the waterfall legs to the floor at the same time. The last thing to do was to clean the silicone off, and I use a mix of detergent and water in a little spray bottle and paper towel. That's all there is to it. When your bead of silicone comes up from pushing the joint nice and tight, you just spray this over the top. Don't try and move any silicone yet. Spray this over the top, and then get a paper towel and just lift the silicone up as you're going, scoop it up with the towel. It's messy, but the silicone will not stick to the surface that you've sprayed this to. It will not stick to it. Left the clamps there for a couple of hours, had a coffee with my daughter, and that was that. So there you go, that's how I did it. Other people were going to use different machines to do it, or they do it by hand. Your call. Now, I'm going to get Emerald, who is my granddaughter, who actually is going to be using the bench top a lot, to help me close the show off. Here we go, she's cute. See you next time. Okay, and a wave. Can I say goodbye to everyone? Bye. Don't forget up here all the stuff, the links, and she's still waving. See you later.